So in doing this, we welcome your questions, but we also ask that you have some sensitivity. If it happens to be that there's a live issue in your workplace, just be alive to the fact that it's best to be respectful of confidentiality. I'd rather entertain your questions, and Terry and I are available at the break or when we conclude today at 4 o'clock. Also know that for a lot of people, they would have got this memo in their inbox. We've got respect in the workplace training. Good Lord, I'd rather eat a light bulb. I have got way more things I need to do than sit through a workshop like this. So I appreciate that for most people, they're not thinking this is the best use of time. But I'm glad, we're glad to have your attention on this, because the whole goal for us is to give you enough information that you can make the safest choices for yourself and employment. This isn't an intention, as I said, to make things more complicated, but to allow the room for conversations to happen if they need to, and for you to know maybe a little self-reflection if there's some room for you to do a little personal tune-up on things.
I'll say the disclaimer as Heather did last time. We have a disclaimer because we do tell war stories about other workplaces we've been in when they've had problems, and we'd like you to learn from those stories, but we tell it like it is. And this is more a disclaimer for Heather because she's the one with the potty mouth. So she's the one that might be using some language which is kind of edgy. I'm sure you've heard it before, but again, if we cross the line, please tell us and we'll try and tone it down a bit. We don't think that anything is gained by trying to sugarcoat these kinds of incidents that do happen all the time in workplaces, and that's where the learning comes in.
Yeah, so everybody sign the waiver. I'm not going to file a complaint against Heather McKenzie. I'd just rather, I think it's better to talk about this subject plainly. So as Terry said, I'm open to the feedback too. If it is too much, just let me know however you feel you need to let me know.
So
and for those of you who are watching this, sorry.
After the fact. Wayne's going to edit it so we look great.
Fantastic. Angelina Jolie profile only.
So what do we want to what do we want to get out of today? We're going to talk about a couple of policies in play here that are part of the subject matter. You've got a respect in the workplace policy, and you've got a code of business conduct policy. Again, we're not going to read off those policies chapter and verse. That would be too painful. What we're going to do is we're going to highlight the sections that are relevant for you and that have us engage in this discussion in the context of this idea of what is a respectful workplace, the title of this workshop. Yes?
Where is this code of business conduct?
I think it's on your Chorus Central. Is that what you call it?
Your intranet?
Your intranet. You may not have seen it before. I understand that there's a lot of policies in play out there that maybe some people haven't seen. I think the respect in the workplace policy is probably a little bit more well distributed, but I think on Chorus Central you'll have all that stuff. But we can check with Mark.
I can't see very far, so I don't know if Mark is still here or if Rowena is here. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, you can find it's located on Chorus Central. So if you go over to Human Resources, or you can actually just type in respect in the workplace, and it will come up right away in the search. So you'll find it there.
Thanks, Mark.
It is important to be familiar with it. Again, one way or another, you're expected to know what it has to say. But today in the workshop that we're going to be doing, we will breathe life into that. So you're going to have an understanding of what it is that it says. There's no employer in Canada that can contract out of its obligations as an employer, which requires every Canadian employer to provide safe workplaces free from discrimination, harassment, and in some workplace contexts, depending on who you work for and where you work, you also have the protection for a psychologically safe workplace, which for sort of regular terminology means workplace bullying. You are one such workplace. So today the subjects we're going to be covering in this idea of respect in the workplace is workplace harassment, workplace bullying, and workplace discrimination. What is it? What is it not? What's expected of you? What are the protections you have? How can you deal with those things? And whatever else might come up in the discussion along the way.
And the other thing we're going to talk a lot about that isn't really in the title of the workshop is conflict. Why does it happen? How do we deal with it? How can we deal with it in its first instance amongst ourselves so we don't have to file grievances, we don't have to file complaints, we don't have to talk to lawyers or HR? Sometimes you have to do those. Those are options of last resort though. So we're going to talk about those tools to put in your toolbox or sharpen the tools you've got so that you're comfortable having those discussions with one another when stuff flares up. Because there's always going to be stuff flaring up at work, always. So this is our agenda. I don't want you to feel too daunted by what we're going to cover. We're going to talk about discrimination and what we call discriminatory harassment, as Heather mentioned. Then we're going to talk a bit about sexual harassment. That is still a big issue in a lot of workplaces and certainly in the media world. We're going to talk about something called poison work environment. And then we're going to get into personal harassment and bullying, which is obviously an ongoing issue in a lot of workplaces. And time permitting, we're going to talk about what is your workplace, which sounds like an obvious talk. Well, I know what my workplace is. I get out of bed in the morning, I come to work, I go out in the field, that's my workplace. But today it's a really important topic because with social media and electronic communication, essentially our workplaces are now limitless. They're very, very broad. And everything we're talking about applies to that workplace. So this is called the respectful workplace. It's a topic that has a lot of different ideas attached to it. Everyone has a different idea of what it is. There's nothing wrong with that. So we'd just like to get a sense from you in the room before we go forward. What does that term mean to you, respectful workplace? If you show up to a respectful workplace, what does it look like? What does it feel like? It doesn't have to be a legal answer or a correct answer, just kind of an intuitive response. And then we're just going to throw some of your comments on the board there with Heather. So what does a respectful workplace mean to you? Sure. Inclusive.
Love it.
Thank you. What
Great.
else?
Appreciate each other.
You all put up your hands. You're very polite. It's like a grade 3 class. No, you can just shout them out too.
Good.
Excellent. Appreciate each other.
Be positive.
Safe.
Safe and be positive.
Yeah, don't bring your negativity from like other situations.
I'll be more blunt. Don't bring your shit to work. Yeah. I get it. Safety, that is a great comment because so much of where the law is coming from and your employer's policies are coming from, as Heather said, is a point of safety. Up till recently, safety just meant physical safety. That was the workers' comp stuff, which is important in an environment like this, of course. Now we're talking about being psychologically safe at work. It's a much broader concept, so thanks for that. What else? Respectful workplace. Non-discriminatory. Non-discriminatory for sure, thank you. Any other thoughts? Not to be competitive, but the last group got like double, so.
Oh, fair. How about that? Let's say that.
It's kind of a bit different because it's, I don't know if it's because of where we work, whatever. Free from the sort of underlying sort of sarcasm or, you know, there are a lot of smart people here, a lot of witty people here. Sometimes it's a little too harsh.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Sometimes it's a little too much, and sometimes you can't say what you think, whatever, because if that person's in the room, you know, you're going to get ding,
Okay.
and that's annoying.
What can we call that? Maybe we could call it
This is
maybe.
a good point.
Sarcasm?
That's a really good point. Maybe just respecting some boundaries and maybe being just professional.
I'm going to put respectful.
Of people's feelings.
Accommodating. That's not a bad word to attach to that. Thank you.
Opal, that was terrible. People's feelings. And I'm going to put here sarcasm. Yep, good. We're going to talk about that. Supportive,
Being
nice.
supportive, sure.
Yeah, which leads to let people like be themselves.
That's all good if the people are good and kind. As opposed to as yeah, that's right, right? Like in the realm
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So, but I think where you're going with that is that's important is we are all individuals. And just because people don't see the universe the same way, don't dress the same way, maybe, you know, they do things a little differently, having a sense of respect, the fact that we're not cookie cutter people. And as long as we're kind, and as long as we're pulling in the same direction and we're not harming one another, being individual is totally cool, right? So can I say that? Can I say respect individuality?
Yeah.
Please do.
Nice. Thanks.
I mean, because you're in a very unique industry. You combine technology and engineering with business and with, in a sense, creative arts. I mean, these are very kind of interesting hybrid of talents and skill sets. So you want to support that individuality, so you're bringing that to your work. Back here? Mindful. Mindfulness.
That's a great word.
Mindful is a great word. They're teaching that in the schools now. For those who have kids in the school system, mindfulness is now a big thing in schools. Also, they're teaching that in the sense of being aware of your behaviors and bullying behaviors and that sort of thing. So
I like
thank
that
you.
word a lot because so often people assume when we talk about the subject matter they go, well, this doesn't really apply to me, because what you're talking about here is trying to out the people who deliberately make other people's lives difficult. The people who are intentionally horrible. You know, the bigots, the bum pinchers, we're here to deal with that, and that's just not me. What we have experienced in the work that we've done in resolving workplace conflicts is the reality that the vast majority of issues arise through recklessness, where people just aren't really thinking about what they're saying or doing, or don't really particularly think about where it's going to land or how it might impact somebody. It's more inadvertent. It's more often clumsy. Somebody hasn't had a tune-up maybe on how that tone of voice sounds. The fact that the sarcasm isn't funny. It's starting to be like that knife that cuts you over and over.
Hurtful.
It's missing that idea that we have a responsibility to enhance the workplace, not to harm it. I've got a poster on my wall at home as the mother of children ranging in the age from 10 to 18, and knowing that I can have my buttons pressed big time and not be the prophet of what it is I speak about. I'm not perfect at this at all. And my kids are quick to remind me of this. You teach this stuff, Mom? Really? Yep. I know, hypocrisy. So I have a sign on my wall at home, and it's speak to preclude conflict, not to provoke it. And I think we can easily slip into that place of unkindness when we are worn thin, when we're exhausted, when we have had conflicts or issues with people that have gone unresolved and we just don't give them the same latitude anymore. So we get cranky in how we speak. This stuff really has nothing to do with the law at all. It's the reality of what starts breeding conflicts and issues that then over time have the risk of attracting these kinds of labels. And mindfulness is a great practice. If you can think and be accountable for yourself and allow yourself room to be held accountable if someone takes a chance on you, this is valuable. Can we just skip right to Lencioni for a minute?
Yeah, we will. But are there any other thoughts on respectful workplace? Any ideas that might be the same or add to the list? All great ideas. So there's a great book out there. We don't espouse a lot of books. But this is a great book in the field. It's written by a guy named Patrick Lencioni, an American. He's out of New York. And you might have heard of this book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. Has anyone read that or heard of it? Yeah, it's been around for a while. I think it was published in 2002. And it's a short book. It's a great read. It'd be good for people with busy lives. It only takes you a couple of hours to read it. And it's a fictionalized story. But it takes place in a company that's not doing well, and nobody can figure out why. And so it talks about the leadership team and how they have different personalities. And you probably have met a lot of these characters in the book along the way. So it'll hit home with you. But Lencioni kind of figured out what we've been teaching for so many years, and he kind of got filthy rich on it, so I resent him for that. But he talks about the 5 dysfunctions in the sense of this triangle, and Heather's going to take you through that, and in the concept of conflict management.
We're not suggesting your workplace is dysfunctional by any means, but there's a certain truth and a certain consistency to the world of conflict. More often than not, when you enter into a situation where things aren't going well, there is a consistent reason why. And one of those main reasons, the one truth about any conflict, is no matter what it's about, if you actually peel away the layers, the superficial stuff, all of the emotion of it all, what you get down to is the fact that there are needs that aren't being met. Think about that for 1 second. That every conflict, that fight you might have had on the way out the door this morning, that difference that maybe you're having with a coworker here, the issue you're having with somebody on your hockey team or on the parent advisory council, the reality is it's about a need not being met. What we tend to not be good at is putting voice to that, because we get caught up in the rest of the bump around it. So the what's in it for you today and listening to what we have to say, aside from the takeaways about your policy and what the law has to say, we really want to encourage you to be the kind of workplace where issues can be spoken about safely. And this is where I think that Lencioni is particularly interesting. The first layer of this triangle, I think, is very true. Where groups are not functioning well, again, whether it happens to be a mosque, whether it happens to be a church, whether it happens to be a sports team, whether it happens to be a social service group, the reason is because there's an absence of trust. This doesn't simply mean, like, Terry and I work together and I trust him completely. The truth is, he's a way better lawyer than I am. La 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 la, put the cone of silence so his head doesn't swell. He's really good at what he does. I know he's reliable, he's really efficient, he's gonna do a great job at what he does. I trust him implicitly as a colleague. That trust matters, right? Between your team, between your colleagues, the trust in capacity matters. But what Lencioni speaks about is the trust for emotional safety. And he says in a real trusting relationship, you have the ability to be vulnerable. And in fact, that's important in establishing trust. Now that word freaks out a lot of people because it sounds all very emotional. But vulnerability, where the day that Terry's let me down, where something fell short, I can say to him, what I need you to know is when we were sitting around that table and we were discussing a different way to do case management, I put forward an idea that I felt I'd really thought out, and I saw you push yourself away from the table and roll your eyes. And I gotta say, I felt you were really dismissing my idea. Now, the reality is I couldn't have that conversation, that moment at the boardroom table, because I was too hurt. I couldn't call him that night because I started to go from hurt to mad. But I gave it 2 days until I got myself collected enough to identify for myself what was my need. In working with you, Terry, I need to know that we can share ideas, and even if we have different opinion of them, that listening to it, hearing it, evaluating it, it's respected. That's what I need from you going forward. In this relationship, I have to feel safe. I'm not going to say this if I think he's going to turn around and say, I'm sorry, you're telling me I'm doing what wrong? Because let me tell you all the things that piss me off about you. Let me tell you about that crappy report you wrote. And the best defense becomes the offense. That's a risk in workplaces. What we want to challenge you with is a moment to think for yourself. Am I a safe place such that if someone came to me to say I'd crossed the line, I would listen to where they were coming from, not add gas to the fire, and say, I'm really glad that you took a chance on me to let me know, because I'd like to make sure we get this right. You have no idea how deeply powerful that is, and yet I know it's hard to do. If that happened, I could stop talking, and that would be nice for you all, wouldn't it? But you wouldn't get any further with issues because that level of accountability exists. That's the sweet spot. Almost every issue that amounted to something called harassment, discrimination, or bullying could have had that sweet spot in most cases, not always, where if it had been safe enough, there would have been a place to go to say, you need to know how that made me feel, and what I need is for that not to happen again. Because that's the number one thing people are looking for as resolution. They're not usually looking for heads to roll or for major punishments, and nor is your employer. They want a place where it is safe enough that issues can be resolved in manners that are informally and restorative for the rest of the workplace. So bringing it up isn't telling tales. Looking to address it is really what we're seeking. So are you the safe place that someone can tell? Because here is what else is in it for you. In this law, many people think, if I tell a joke and it doesn't land well, but nobody tells me it's not okay, I can't be held accountable for that. Nobody told me it was wrong. Nobody told me it was offensive, so how am I supposed to know? They think that you have to tell somebody. Now, I think in a perfect world, you do. But legally speaking, it will not absolve you of responsibility if someone doesn't. That's kind of hard. I get why the law runs that way, but what you need to know is you cannot have that misconception The fact that someone hasn't told you or didn't let you know, I think that's the thing we hear most commonly when we are picking up the pieces post-conflict. Often Terry and I are asked to work with respondents, people who have been accused of not doing this well, who've misstepped or have breached a policy in this. And we sit with these people, and they're not the evil-headed ogres with, that look like they've got fire coming out of their ears. These are regular folks like you and I who have misstepped and largely had no idea. But that doesn't save them in an investigation. So they sit with us and we talk to them about what they need to know to be able to do things differently and more safely. And they're frustrated. Usually they say, I am so sad. If I had only known. If I'd only known this is how I had come across. If I'd only known that this is how that landed for this person, I would have never wanted them to feel that way. And I wish I'd had a chance to make it right. I think, like, if I had a nickel for every time that someone said that, truly we would retire. But that's the question. Why didn't they? Was it safe enough for somebody to tell you? So I want you to really think, if I cross the line, will I have the benefit of knowing before someone feels that they have to go somewhere else? You have way more control over the reality of how issues will unfold because of that. Because if you don't have that kind of trusted relationship, the chances are people are too afraid to have useful conflict. That's the second layer on this Lencioni triangle. And we all know what that looks like. How many people have families that don't want to actually talk about stuff, but you're all sitting around the Thanksgiving table and it is tense. And so you're like, okay, that's that artificial, he talks about artificial harmony. We're all pretending it's fine. Pass the fucking potatoes. And it's not fine. And that's not helpful or healthy in a workplace. So I'm not going to address the other parts of this, but I want you to really think about, what do I contribute in my workplace? Am I a positive person who helps people have a safe space to do what they do? When I screw up, do I take accountability for my actions and earnestly try to do it differently? And if I have no clue, do my people around me know that they can let me know? If you do that, you're likely to have a pretty straight path of positivity. So I'm going to just leave that there unless there's any particular questions about that.
Yeah,
I have a question.
Please.
In achieving trust, how do you navigate through the minefield of ego?
Oh, I guess that's a whole nother workshop. but,
Yeah.
Well, I just,
No, that's a great question. So for those of you who didn't hear it, how do you navigate through the minefield of ego when you're trying to build that trust? Because everyone has an ego, some more pronounced than others, of course. And some professions have more egos running rampant than others. So that's a really good point. I think what I would say to that is I think this is such a universal thing that even people with egos should get it. Even people with egos can have problems with other people. Even people with egos can be embarrassed and feel hurt by something that's been done to them. So they should be buying into this as well. And maybe the best way to navigate that is to bring it all down to everyone's on the same level.
I have so many things in my head on that question because it's really multi-layered when you bring it up. Especially in the world of media and any workplace where there's a certain power element to it, a certain celebrity element to it, there is a lot of ego tied into it, and that can't be overlooked. I was working recently with probably one of the largest financial institutions in the country about an issue they had with the super rainmaker of the organization. I was talking about this at the break before with someone, and I said, I didn't even know that this much money flowed through our financial institutions in Canada, that the amount that this person brought in terms of revenues. And this person had such an ego that that was also coupled with an incapacity for empathy. So the ego was so large, there was no room for anyone else. There was no room for any sense of feeling. And so as a result, they cut a swath through the organization, multiple people leaving because of the unkindness that came from an ego that just bulldozed through that workspace like a giant rhinoceros. And it finally came to a place where the organization recognized what it was. And I thought enormously powerful when they terminated that Rainmaker to say it doesn't matter how important you may think you are, how much revenue you bring in. Having an ego is fine, but it needs to be balanced with the fact that you are not the only human being in the room. So with the ego, the question that I have is, how does one know how to balance it? You can be a big personality, you can be highly important, but I would suggest that the measure of somebody who deserves to have that sense of authority and importance really is measured in the way you make people feel. Not in the amount of accounts you bring in, not in the amount of business you bring in, not in the level of viewership that you attach, but at the end of the day, your legacy is going to be, how did you make people feel?
Any other thoughts on the stuff before we move on? I would just simply add to what Heather said that, you know, it's ironic that when people come to us, which we think is a complaint, they've got an issue with us, our initial reaction, our natural reaction is that we're pissed off, that we get defensive. Your reaction should be, thank you, because that's a gift. If someone's taken a chance on you to say, you know, built up that courage, and it takes a bit of courage to have that tough conversation with you, that is so much a gift for you, because you'd rather have the conversation with them than 3 weeks later having to talk to HR or your director or the CEO.
Not that your HR is not lovely and nice, or your director or your CEO, but we all know that it's better to deal with things directly.
Yep.
So here it is in a nutshell. Someone comes to you to tell you something that's not okay. The hardest thing of all is to not have that visceral reaction to defend yourself. So to be able to listen fully while keeping it zipped, and to say, as Terry said, I'm glad to know. I'm glad to know. That doesn't, some people go, well, I don't want to admit to doing this. I don't want to take, you know, that's it. That's admitting I've done wrong. No, I'm glad to know. And then the question really is, what is it that I need to do to make this okay for you? That is the most powerful two things you can ever say, because you're validating that somebody has the right to let you know how they feel, and then you're not pretending to know what the answer is. Because really what you're saying is, it matters to me. I may not see this quite the same way, but I appreciate that this feels this way for you, and I want to make it right. If that can happen, that can really turn the situation into a very positive stream.
There's a question?
Yeah, I was just going to ask if you guys have, like, or if they reference it in the book as to whether there's a certain bubble that the trust piece should extend to within a corporate structure. I mean, in a perfect world, obviously, it would be everybody trusts everybody. But
Right.
is there some sort of suggestion as to kind of what the, you know, the sought out standard would be? Like, is it just your direct reporting structure and your direct employees, or really is it?
I mean, I think, yeah, it's a good question. I think Lencioni's point is really this is an organization-wide idea. Certainly, I think the message he gives in the book is it often will start top-down, that if your leadership doesn't have this, then what's the point? So really, if there's a starting point, it certainly would be with leadership. And then that should trickle down to the rest of the organization. But it can start anywhere. It can evolve and germinate anywhere in an organization.
There's a whole spectrum of ancillary books to this, and one of the, again, I'm not here to sell Lencioni's books. It just, I really felt like in a very easily digestible way, there's good light shed on this in this particular work. But really, what he says, and I think we agree with completely, is it's very important that there be alignment on this subject through the organization, because nothing fractures trust like the sense of hypocrisy. So this law, by the way, this law applies to everyone. It doesn't matter where you exist in the organization. It doesn't even matter if you're getting a paycheck from the organization. If you had a summer student who was in for work experience, there's an expectation that they have protection from discrimination, harassment, and bullying in the workplace. Just because they aren't getting they're not getting a check every 2 weeks doesn't matter. In providing services or being connected with Chorus/Global. By the way, I'm going to just continue to use the term, we're going to continue to use the term global, understanding that, of course, your parent company is Chorus. But in those circumstances, everybody is to be held to that standard. And as we said at the very beginning, the fact that maybe you never had this workshop doesn't change the playing field. There's an expectation that you know what is expected of you, being connected to your employer in doing what you do for the organization.
Any other comments?
I know there's laws, and that's good, but what will be the outcome?
So
really,
what's,
if you were to follow through?
With this idea?
Just anything, any work, like discrimination, harassment, whatever, what would actually be the outcome?
super good question. I want to be able to use the whiteboard again. So I just want to acknowledge these ideas are phenomenal. The idea of inclusivity, mindfulness, feeling appreciated, safe, having a positive environment where if you're the negative Norton, you know, you're not bringing that stuff in to impact people at work, that you are non-discriminatory in what you're doing, that you treat people with fairness, respecting that people are individuals and they have differences, being supportive, and above all else, I think that we've talked about this, understanding that you got to be respectful of how people feel. That's the underpinning to what we're talking about. If there is an issue of harassment, discrimination, bullying, and I'm loath to use those labels, but in the event that you felt an issue needed to come forward, I'm feeling like this isn't okay for me, let's get away from the labels of what it is. But you say, I need to have some help because I'm sitting in the coffee room and I'm having coffee, and I know that people are feeling like it's kind of funny. They've been making jokes recently about something that was, you know, yeah, it was in the news, but now you've taken that issue far and I'm uncomfortable with it. I want to have something done. I'll give you a particular example. In a media workplace, there had been a story about a Holocaust memorial that was being fundraised for in Quebec. The subject came up in the coffee room, and as it did, an individual said, you know, and I'm going to tone back my language on this one, but you can insert a whole lot of really colorful words. I am sick and tired of these blankety blank blank Jews always getting what they want. Seems that everybody's believed their version of events and history. What about all the good things that Hitler did? I think this is utterly ridiculous, and we've been sucked in by all of this stuff. So this conversation happens in a coffee room, and somebody feeling impacted by what was said goes to HR and says, this isn't okay. This is not okay. So Human Resources invites the person who had made the commentary up to their offices and says, so this was overheard by a number of people in the coffee room, and we're not okay with this. Our organization is not okay with intolerance, and what you've said is not okay. The response from that employee was, we work in media. I'm entitled to freedom of speech. This is what's important. This is what we believe in, so I should be able to say what I want. You have no friggin' business censoring me. And by the way, I was on my break. I'm not paid for that time. That's my time, not your time. So, two things to that. Wrong and wrong. Legally, it's very important. Freedom of speech, your fundamental freedoms of as Canadians. Terry and I are so proud of what we have. These things that are given to you by the law in this country that are so important. But what you need to know is those rights become circumscribed, okay? They become limited in certain aspects of our life. So although I may be able to exercise my feelings about that, as long as I'm not trotting into the criminal code, which, you know, even going down that road presents question marks. So if I'm not stepping across the criminal code line of hate speech, let's just pretend I haven't, right there and then, I can't say just anything I want without repercussions in certain areas. Number one, we're going to talk about today, is in the course of employment. Human rights law limits your freedom of speech in your employment context. So you don't have free rein to say whatever you wish and not have the possibility of repercussions. If you choose to say whatever you wish and stand on this pedestal of free speech, just want you to know the risk you're taking in making that choice. At some point, the employer can't simply say, oh, okay, freedom of speech, bring it on. It becomes problematic. Other areas where it becomes circumscribed are things like services customarily available to the public, etc. But we're not going to focus on that. The other thing important about that particular case was that this idea of a defense that, well, I'm off the clock, so you can't hold me accountable for what I say or do. Understand that these laws apply 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, where what you say or do may have a subsequent detrimental impact on the functioning of the workplace. Does that make sense? So there's this connection, there's like this bungee cord of connection. Doesn't matter if I'm on my sofa at 2 o'clock in the morning having finished a bottle of Merlot and I'm feeling really brave about what I'm going to throw on my Facebook page about how much I cannot stand the corporation. You can't defend yourself by saying, but it was my own time. It was my own device. That's not going to be successful. So wherever you're at, be mindful that if there is that connection to work and the potential that you may impact the reputation of the employer, relationships with people you work with, or relationships or reputation of a stakeholder. If what you say or do has a subsequent negative impact on those three things, that's super risky for you. So in that situation we talked about in that coffee room, this is my long story to get back to your important question. What happens now? In a perfect workplace, what one is looking for when you bring these issues forward is not to bring down the house with a heavy-handed outcome. You're looking to measure what has happened with what makes sense to restore the workplace so that the situation is understood to be unacceptable and that we feel confident it won't repeat itself. In a perfect world, that is what happens, and that's the intention when one comes forward with an issue, is how do we ensure that this doesn't happen again? How do we ensure that it's understood that this isn't okay? And oftentimes there's a learning opportunity. Many of the workshops we do is as a result of coming in to kind of help create that level of understanding again. But it's very individualized, depending on what the issue is. Had another situation in a workplace where it was a full-scale sexual assault. In that particular workplace, someone forcefully had intercourse with someone else at work on a night shift. In that situation, clearly, there's going to be a different outcome. But on the spectrum of this subject matter, from the jokes to insensitive commentary to extreme acts, there may be a whole spectrum of ways that they get resolved. But in the regular stream of things, what one is looking for is restoration as opposed to punishment.
And certainly when we get thrown into those situations, either one-on-ones or investigations, and what we hear, and that's generally what we hear from complainants. They don't want someone punished. They want the misbehavior simply to stop. And then when we do hear, no, I want him fired or her fired or his balls on a plate or I don't know what the anatomy equivalent, then that sends a flag up to us, something else is going on here. Because that's not the normal response of somebody who has been at the receiving end of this misbehavior, because they simply want it to stop. That's really their first ask. It's not even an apology. They just want it to stop and get on with their work life. So any more thoughts about this stuff and Lencioni's triangle? So we're working towards a workplace that's free from harassment, discrimination, and bullying. And we put our cute little unicorn up there. My 11-year-old daughter collects those still. Because, of course, that is the land of rainbows and unicorns, right? Because there's no such thing as a workplace free. There certainly is no such thing as a workplace free from conflict, nor should there be. So that's kind of the ideal.
We don't mean to be facetious about it. That's the ideal, right? It's the ideal. But what we know is conflicts arise everywhere, And each and every one of you have the potential to be misunderstood. If you think you're super perfect, then you've got the ego we've got some concerns about, because we're not all perfect. We will all make mistakes. What we're looking for is the opportunity to be able to get it back on track. So hopefully it's not an issue that is so major that that opportunity doesn't exist.
We do want to highlight kind of the scope clause of the policy, as we call it, and this highlights something that Heather said, which is everybody's covered by these policies. Nobody's exempt. It covers employees, it covers third-party people like customers, contractors, vendors, and it doesn't even have to be industry or media specific. If Global or Chorus contracts with someone to service your IT equipment or service your water coolers, that's a business contact, and the policy covers them in terms of their behavior with you and vice versa. And it's very much a two-way street. You know, you're expected to behave in a certain way towards each other and the people you do business with, but you have an expectation to be treated in the same way. So it's very much an equality there. So where do all the rules come from? And again, we don't want to get too much into the rule stuff, but there are some important things we have to learn about today. One is human rights law, which we're going to get into right away in terms of things like discrimination and discriminatory harassment. You are a federally regulated industry, so it's the Federal Human Rights Act that covers you, but really at the end of the day, it's very similar to all the other laws in Canada. We do have WorkSafe BC legislation that does kick in terms of bullying and harassment. You've got your internal corporate policies, and you've got a collective agreement for those of you that are members of the bargaining unit. So all of these things marry and merge together quite well to give you an umbrella of protection from misbehavior, but they also impose on you certain obligations to behave a certain way as well. And in answer to one of the questions from the last session, none of these things contradict one another. Just because you're a unionized employee doesn't mean you're exempt from going the policy route or vice versa. These things do live and cohabitate together quite well. And again, they generally say the same thing.
And if anybody thinks again that, well, but we're so special. In media, we have our own culture. We're just a unique environment for this. I am sure you are all very special. I have no doubt.
I sense that when they
I have no doubt. However, you don't have a special set of rules for media. Just like the RCMP doesn't have a set of rules, or corrections doesn't have a separate rules, or the librarians, I have to tell you.
Filthy.
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 They, don't ever judge a book by its cover. And I mean that, and I truly mean that. It is
they could
really
outdo
fun.
you at every
But there's
turn.
a parallel actually, because they are very, in academia as well, really closely hold how important it is, that right of, that freedom, right? The idea of freedom of expression, that censorship is something that is abhorrent. So there's actually an incredible parallel in that. And on this, what we want to tell you is this does not squelch how valuable and important vigorous debate on ideas is. This does not squelch the importance of us being able to have different ideas and share them. This is simply having the common sense that in doing so, you do so in a way that's respectful. Yep. It doesn't, come to my house. We are all big personalities with big ideas. I said, from the littlest one at the table to the elders at the table, we all have space to be able to share ideas, but the ground rule about that is it can't get personal. So share your differences. We all have different political perspectives, different environmental ideas, and that's cool. But you cannot allow that to get personal, because that's the moment, and I don't mean it's my fault if I take it personally. It's my responsibility as the person who's the author of what's being said to be mindful of how that could potentially land. So this doesn't squelch any of those things. It's reminding you, though, that you're not the one who's the thermostat setter for the universe of your office, okay?
So human rights law, what does it do? It does protect us from discrimination and certain forms of harassment, not all forms. It protects us from what we call discriminatory harassment. We don't want to get too hung up on those labels, though. Let's just talk about what that is. There's all kinds of areas in your life that human rights law kicks in, whether you're a federal employee or a provincial one. The ones we're going to focus on, obviously, are having to do with employment. You can't be treated unfairly, and you can't lose out on employment opportunities if it's based on some sort of discriminatory act or behavior. So what is discrimination? If you have to define it, it's an action or decision that has a negative impact on a person or group of people. and it has to be based on something called a prohibited ground. In other jurisdictions, they call it a protected ground. So it actually is limited. There's a box within which this law operates. So what's a prohibited ground? A prohibited ground is a trait or characteristic about a person or a group of people. The law says we deem that worthy of protection. I can't discriminate against Heather on the basis of X. X is a prohibited ground. It's a trait about her. It may be anything. So let's get a sense from you in the room. What do you think is on that list? There may be some obvious choices. Don't worry about being right or wrong, that we're going to talk about it all. So I can't discriminate on the basis of X. What would X be? Just throw some ideas out there. Race, gender.
Okay, nice.
Oh,
Good, I got
I
it.
have to go back to hands. So race, religion, gender. I heard what else?
Illness.
Age, disability, sexual orientation, family status. Giving Heather a workout.
This is good.
You guys are like totally firing all cylinders here.
It's because you put them to the challenge saying
I
the
know.
other group was better. Family
When they
status.
you definitely were faster out of the gate on that
There we
one.
go. Good, good, good.
So race, gender, religion, illness, age, disability, sexual orientation, family status. What else might be on that list? Sorry? Ethnicity.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts? You
And
know,
we'll-
we make decisions every day, judgments about people. Some of them may be unfair. Maybe some of them are protected by law, maybe they're not. So what do we make judgments on?
Yeah.
Sure, money. Class, or lack thereof.
Money,
or
looks, class. I like these all in order here.
position. Seniority. Appearance. Appearance is pretty big. Did you say appearance as well? Yeah.
We make a lot of assumptions about people. How many of you are
Yep.
age? We got that. Yep. How many of you do hiring or interviews for jobs? Anyone?
Oh,
Few people.
a few on the side, yeah. Quite a few.
And it's an interesting subject matter because somebody comes into an interview and there's a certain point of evaluation, right? You see somebody sit down and there's a certain impression given. That's human nature. What the law on discrimination asks, though, is that you be mindful that there are certain things that in most cases you should never take into account. Now, for those of you who don't do hiring and you're like, well, then this is irrelevant to me, the expansion of this subject goes to how you treat one another in the workplace as well. That there is no reason to treat somebody differently in a negative way based on these prohibited grounds. There are very specific ones that are set out in the legislation.